Hello, dear viewers, and welcome to Woven English, where we teach English through powerful, dramatic, and unforgettable stories. Today, we begin a story that will leave you breathless. It is the story of a girl who had nothing, no crown, no army, no power. She was not Russian. She did not speak the language. She did not know the people. She did not belong there, and yet she became the most powerful ruler Russia had ever seen. She overthrew her own husband. She commanded armies. She expanded an empire across millions of miles. She collected lovers, like other queens, collected jewels. And she ruled with a brilliance so sharp, so dangerous, so magnificent, that even today, more than 200 years after her death, we still call her by the name she earned, Catherine the Great. This is not just a history lesson. This is a story of ambition and loneliness, of love and betrayal, of a woman who looked at a world that said, "You cannot," and answered, "Watch me." And if you are learning English, you are in the right place. Because the best way to truly learn a language is not through grammar exercises or vocabulary lists. It is through stories. Real stories, human stories, stories that make your heart beat faster and your mind stay open. So, stay with us. Every word, every sentence, every scene, it is your English growing stronger. And before we begin, write in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is in your country right now. Now, let's begin. Before she was Catherine the Great, before she was Empress, before she was a legend, she was just a little girl named Sophia. Sophia Augusta Frederica was born on May 2nd, 1729, in Stettin, Prussia, a city that today belongs to Poland. Her father, Prince Christian August, was a serious and strict man who served loyally in the Prussian military. Her mother, Princess Johanna, was something else entirely, ambitious, restless, always dreaming of a greater life for herself and her family. The family was noble, yes, but not powerful, not wealthy, not important enough to matter in the great game of European royalty. Sophia, however, was not an ordinary child. From a very young age, she loved books more than dolls. She was curious about everything: philosophy, languages, politics, history. While other girls her age were learning to sew and sing, Sophia was asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. She spoke German and French fluently. She was sharp, observant, and deeply ambitious. But in the 18th century, ambition in a girl was not encouraged. It was barely tolerated. Women were expected to marry well, obey their husbands, have children, and disappear quietly into a life of domestic duty. Sophia had other ideas. She just did not know yet how to use them. Then one day, everything changed. A letter arrived at their small household. It was an invitation, but it felt more like a summons, a destiny wrapped in paper and royal seal. The Empress of Russia, Elizabeth, daughter of the legendary Peter the Great, was searching for a wife for her nephew. His name was Grand Duke Peter. He was the heir to the Russian throne. And someone had suggested little Sophia from Stettin as a possible match. Sophia's mother, Johanna, trembled with excitement. This was it. This was their golden door. If Sophia could marry this prince, if she could win the favor of Empress Elizabeth, she would one day become the Empress of Russia, the most powerful woman on earth. But there was so much standing in the way. Sophia had never met Peter. She had never been to Russia. She did not speak Russian. She did not know Russian customs, Russian religion, or Russian people. And she was only 14 years old. In the winter of 1744, Sophia and her mother boarded carriages and began the long, brutal journey east. The roads were frozen. The nights were bitterly cold. The journey took weeks, and with every mile, Sophia moved further from everything she had ever known. Her home, her father, her language, her familiar world. When she finally arrived in St. Petersburg, she was stunned. Russia was nothing like Germany. The palaces were enormous, golden and gleaming under the winter sky. The Orthodox churches had onion-shaped domes that seemed to pierce the clouds. The people wore thick fur coats and spoke in a language that sounded like music and thunder at the same time. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was enormous. Russia was not a small German duchy. Russia was an empire, one of the largest in the world. And Sophia was walking into its very heart. The first test was the Empress herself. Elizabeth was a woman of tremendous energy and strong opinions. She was not a gentle or patient woman. She had fought and maneuvered her way to power, and she had very little tolerance for weakness, dishonesty, or foolishness. When Sophia was brought before her, she curtsied deeply and spoke with careful respect. Elizabeth studied her, and then she smiled. She liked this girl. She saw some things in Sophia's eyes: intelligence, composure, ambition carefully hidden beneath good manners. But there were conditions. If Sophia wanted to stay in Russia, if she wanted to marry Peter, she had to convert to the Russian Orthodox religion. She had to abandon her Lutheran faith, abandon her German name, and become Russian, fully, completely, and publicly. Sophia agreed. She was baptized into the Orthodox Church. She was given a new name, Yekaterina Alexeyevna. In English, Catherine. She was no longer Sophia. She was Catherine now. And Catherine had a plan. She began studying Russian with a ferocity that astonished everyone around her. She practiced late into the night, long after her tutors had gone to bed. She murmured Russian words in her sleep. She prayed in Russian. She spoke to the palace servants in Russian, stumbling over the words, laughing at her own mistakes, trying again. The Russian people noticed. The courtiers noticed. Even the cold and suspicious Empress noticed. This foreign girl was not here as a guest. She was here to become one of them, and that made all the difference. But then she met Peter. Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian Empire, the man Sophia, now Catherine, had traveled across the frozen continent to marry. He was a disaster. He was thin and pale, with a weak chin and watery eyes. He was immature and childish in a way that went far beyond his age. He spent his days arranging toy soldiers on the floor of his room, playing pretend military battles, completely uninterested in governing, in people, or in Catherine. He did not love Russia. He loved Prussia, Russia's rival. He admired the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, with an almost embarrassing devotion. He did not love Catherine. He barely acknowledged her. Catherine looked at him and felt something cold and clear settle in her chest. This man would be emperor one day, and, if she was not careful, this man would destroy both Russia and her. She had not come this far to be destroyed. So she made a decision. Quietly, privately, the way she made all her most important decisions. She would play the role of dutiful wife. She would smile at events and stand beside him at ceremonies. She would not fight him, not yet, not openly. But she would also educate herself. She would read every political document she could find. She would study history and philosophy and law. She would make herself indispensable to the court, to the empress, to Russia. She would be patient, and she would wait. In 1745, Catherine was 16 years old. The wedding was grand. Fireworks over the Neva River, feasts that lasted for days, music and dancing, and the glittering costumes of 100 noble families. But behind the spectacle, there was nothing. Their marriage was cold, empty, and profoundly unhappy. Peter showed no interest in Catherine as a woman or as a person. He was often cruel in small, petty ways, ignoring her publicly, mocking her in front of others, disappearing for days to drink and play his toy soldiers. Catherine was alone in one of the most magnificent and dangerous courts in the world. She turned to books. She read Voltaire and Montesquieu. She read history, the great rulers, the great empires, the strategies of power. She read for hours each day, filling notebooks with her thoughts, training her mind like a general trains an army. And then she found something else. Love, or at least the warmth that love can bring when loneliness becomes unbearable. His name was Sergei Saltykov. He was a Russian nobleman, charming, handsome, and deeply attentive in all the ways that Peter was not. Their friendship became an affair, conducted in whispers and secret meetings. For the first time since arriving in Russia, Catherine felt seen. She felt alive. She also felt dangerous. Because a woman with a secret has power, and a woman with power, even hidden power, is always a threat to someone. Over the years that followed, Catherine would have several lovers. But these relationships were never simply about romance. Each man brought her something: information, loyalty, military connections, political intelligence. Catherine was learning, always learning, how the real machinery of power worked. And she was getting ready. For 17 years, Catherine endured her marriage. She watched Peter III, as he was now called, make enemy after enemy. He insulted the Russian Orthodox Church. He abandoned the wars that Russia was winning against Prussia and simply gave the enemy their land back. He humiliated his officers, ignored his advisors, and treated the throne like a toy rather than a responsibility. The court watched in disbelief. The army seethed with fury. The church quietly turned away. Catherine watched too, and she began to move. She had by now formed deep alliances with some of Russia's most important military commanders. She had won the respect and genuine affection of many noble families. She had cultivated friendships with church leaders, and she had one more crucial ally. His name was Grigory Orlov. Orlov was a military officer, physically powerful, deeply loyal, and passionately devoted to Catherine. He was also well connected among the soldiers who served in the elite regiments of St. Petersburg. Through Orlov, Catherine reached the army, and through the army she could reach the throne. She did not move impulsively. She did not rush. She waited until the moment was exactly right. That moment came on June 28th, 1762. In the early hours of that morning, Catherine slipped out of her palace. She put on a military uniform. She mounted a white horse, and she rode toward the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, one of Russia's most elite military units. The soldiers were waiting. She had sent Orlov ahead. He had spoken to the men, reminded them of Peter's betrayals and failures, and asked them a simple question: who did they want to lead Russia? When Catherine appeared before them, calm, composed, sitting tall in the saddle, the answer was immediate. The soldiers dropped to their knees. They swore their loyalty. They called her Empress. One regiment became two. Two became three. By the time Catherine rode into St. Petersburg, she had an army at her back. Peter III was in a palace outside the city. When word reached him of what was happening, he tried to organize a defense. But no one came to help him. His generals abandoned him. His allies disappeared. His power evaporated in a single morning. He signed his abdication. He surrendered. A few days later, he was dead. The official cause of death was never confirmed. Some said it was illness. Some said it was an accident. Some said Orlov had given the order. Catherine said nothing. She was already working, already ruling, already thinking about Russia, about the empire, about everything she intended to build. The woman who now sat on the Russian throne was no longer the frightened teenage girl who had arrived in St. Petersburg 20 years earlier, trembling in the snow. She was Catherine the Great, and she had work to do. Catherine believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that a ruler's greatness was measured not in battles won, but in the lives improved. She had read Voltaire and corresponded with him for years. She admired the Enlightenment philosophers who argued that reason, education, and justice were the foundations of a good society. She began to reform Russia with enormous energy. She built schools, not just for boys, but for girls. At a time when educating women was considered unnecessary or even dangerous, Catherine opened institutions dedicated to female education. She believed that an intelligent woman was an asset, not a threat. She reorganized the government, streamlining a bureaucracy that had grown slow and corrupt under decades of careless leadership. She invited scientists, artists, architects, and philosophers from across Europe to come to Russia and share their knowledge. The great Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg was her project. She filled it with thousands of paintings, sculptures, and works of art, building one of the greatest cultural collections in the world. She improved roads, built new cities, and expanded trade. She wrote letters, thousands of them, to the greatest thinkers of her age. She was not merely a queen who patronized culture. She was a participant in it. Her enemies called her a foreign woman playing at being Russian. Russia called her Empress. But Catherine was not only a philosopher queen, she was also a conqueror. Russia under Catherine expanded in ways that reshaped the entire map of Europe and Asia. She won wars against the Ottoman Empire, gaining control of the northern coastline of the Black Sea, a prize that Russian Tsars had been pursuing for generations. This gave Russia warm water ports and access to Mediterranean trade. She participated in the partition of Poland, a complex and morally troubling chapter, in which Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided the weakened Polish state among themselves. Russia gained vast new territories. She extended Russia's reach into Crimea, the Caucasus, and beyond. By the end of her reign, Russia had grown larger than at any previous point in its history, and much of that growth had happened not by accident, but by the deliberate, strategic ambition of a woman who studied maps the way other women studied needlework. But conquest always has a cost. In 1773, a man appeared in the Russian countryside. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. He was a Cossack soldier, rough and charismatic, with a gift for speaking to people who felt forgotten and abandoned. He claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's dead husband, miraculously alive, returned to reclaim his throne. It was a lie, but it was a powerful lie. The peasants of Russia lived in conditions that were close to slavery. The serfs, bound to the land, unable to move, unable to own property, subject to the cruelty of noble landlords, had suffered for centuries with no relief in sight. Pugachev promised them freedom. He promised them land. He promised revenge against the nobles who had kept them poor and powerless. Tens of thousands joined him. The rebellion swept across the Volga region like a wildfire. Cities burned. Nobles were killed. Catherine's governors fled in terror. For a moment, a long, frightening moment. It seemed possible that Catherine might lose everything she had built. She did not panic. She sent her finest generals. She gave them clear orders and the resources they needed. She refused to negotiate with Pugachev or give any impression of weakness. After months of brutal fighting, Pugachev was captured. He was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. He was executed. The rebellion was crushed, but it left a mark on Catherine that never fully faded. She had looked into the face of the suffering she had not managed to fix. The millions of serfs whose lives she had not yet changed, whose freedom she had not given, and she had been afraid. It was one of the few times in her life when Catherine the Great was truly afraid. Among all the men who moved through Catherine's life, one stood apart. Grigory Potemkin. He was not simply a lover. He was not simply a general. He was not simply an advisor. He was her equal, or as close to an equal as Catherine ever allowed anyone to come. Potemkin was enormous in personality, physically striking, deeply intelligent, and wildly unconventional. He wore rich furs and silk robes and scattered food on himself when he ate. He stayed in bed for days and then worked without sleep for a week. He was loud and emotional and brilliant. And he adored Catherine with a depth that was almost frightening. Some historians believe they were secretly married. No document has ever been found to confirm this. But the letters they wrote to each other, tender, passionate, endlessly respectful, suggest a bond that went far beyond politics or desire. Potemkin commanded Russia's armies in the south. He organized the annexation of Crimea. He built cities along the Black Sea coast. He was, in many ways, the instrument through which Catherine's most ambitious dreams became real. Even after their romantic relationship ended, he remained her most trusted advisor until his death in 1791. When news of his death reached Catherine, she wept in a way that those around her said they had never seen before. Openly, without dignity, without control. She was 62 years old, and she had lost the only person who had ever truly known her. Catherine continued to rule for 5 more years after Potemkin's death. She was in her 60s now, older and heavier, but her mind remained as sharp and restless as ever. She continued to read. She continued to write. She continued to govern. She had one great unfinished sorrow, her son, Paul. Paul was her legitimate heir. But their relationship had always been cold and distrustful. Paul believed, possibly correctly, that Catherine had never truly loved him. He resented her. He believed she had stolen the throne from his father. He was suspicious, paranoid, and temperamentally the opposite of everything Catherine valued. She considered removing him from the succession entirely and naming her grandson Alexander as her heir instead. She believed, Alexander had the intelligence and character to continue her work. But before she could act, time ran out. On the morning of November 16, 1796, Catherine rose early and prepared for another full day of work. She had meetings to attend, documents to sign, letters to write. Then she collapsed. She was found on the floor by her servants, unconscious, barely breathing. Doctors were summoned. Priests were called. The court held its breath. She never regained consciousness. On November 17, 1796, Catherine the Great died. She was 67 years old. She had ruled Russia for 34 years. The moment Catherine died, her son Paul became emperor. He moved quickly to dismantle everything she had built, reversing her policies, punishing her allies, attempting to erase her from Russian history. He did not succeed. Paul's reign lasted 5 years. He was assassinated by conspirators in 1801. His son, Alexander I, took the throne and restored many of Catherine's reforms and her vision for Russia. Because her vision was too powerful to destroy. Catherine expanded Russia's borders to their greatest extent in history. She built one of the world's great art collections. She promoted education for women when almost no one else did. She corresponded with the greatest philosophers of the Enlightenment and helped bring their ideas into Russian life. She ruled for 34 years, longer than most male monarchs of her era, and she did it with intelligence, strategy, creativity, and iron determination. She was not perfect. She did not free the serfs. She was capable of cold ruthlessness. She used people, loved them, yes, but used them too. But she was extraordinary. A foreign girl arrived in Russia at 14, speaking none of the language, knowing none of the people, belonging to none of the traditions. And she became the greatest ruler Russia ever had. That is not just history. That is a lesson about patience, about preparation, about the kind of ambition that does not shout. It plans, it studies, it waits, and then, when the moment comes, it acts. Catherine the Great acted, and the world was never quite the same. If this story touched you, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, which part of Catherine's life stayed with you the most? Was it the moment she rode out in her military uniform and took the throne? Was it her long, lonely years of waiting and learning? Or was it the quiet sorrow of losing Potemkin, the one person who truly knew her? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment, and if you are learning English, remember, you just listened to over 3,000 words of real, natural, story-driven English. That is real progress. Be proud of that. If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video and subscribe to Woven English so you never miss a story, because there are so many more stories left to tell. Stay curious. Keep listening, and we will see you in the next one.